right, we are finishing up our series of going all through the Old Testament, and I think next week will be the last week that when we conclude our Old Testament series. So I want you to be thinking about any further questions you might have that we didn't cover over the past few weeks going through the Old Testament. And I know we didn't read from every single book. That would have taken a little too long, but hopefully we gave enough overview. And if there are any big questions that you still have left, I want you to be thinking about them tonight, and then at the end, I want you to shout them out. I'm going to write them down so that we can wrap it up next week. We're going to talk about the book of Daniel tonight, and Daniel has a lot of really interesting things going on in it. So I'm not going to try and rush all of the book of Daniel tonight. I'm going to leave some of the stories and verses. I think we'll read the verses in chapter 1 of Daniel, but I think the other stories I'll save for next week, because I don't want to rush through too much. So next week we'll wrap up Daniel and cover any further questions you might have. So tonight, be thinking about, is there anything else kind of Old Testament wise that you want covered, or an interesting question you have, and I'll write it down and we'll talk about it next Wednesday. Okay, so we're ending our Old Testament series with the book of Daniel because it is probably the last Old Testament book that was written down and finished up, or at least it was definitely one of the last ones. And there's a whole lot going on in the book of Daniel that we don't often read or cover in churches or sermons or Sunday schools, vacation Bible schools, that kind of stuff. Usually when we read passages in the book of Daniel, we usually pull from the first half because that has a lot of the neat, good stories in the first half. So when you think of the book of Daniel, what are some of the stories that you think of?
Lion's Den.
Daniel and the Lion's Den. That's like the big one, number one. That's right. What others?
Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego in the furnace.
That's right, the fiery furnace. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. Why? Why were they thrown in the furnace? Because they
refused to bow to the king.
That's right. King of Babylon had a big statue. Everybody had to bow, and those three did not. So they were thrown in the fiery furnace. That's right. Other stuff in the book of Daniel.
The same thing.
Mhm.
But when you think about it, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego was there. Where was Daniel?
I wonder if that
In the book of Susanna,
Ah.
it tells you where Daniel was, because he had a high position like a Secretary of State.
Mhm.
And he was traveling to an area.
Mhm.
These two priests had accused a woman of being a prostitute. And Daniel thought, wait a minute, there's something wrong here. And so he took her defense. And it's a beautiful story. It's just that it's not in our canonized books.
Yes.
It's in the books of the Apocrypha, but
Yes.
it's not in these books.
I'm going to talk about that in a minute, so I want you to remember that. We're going to come back to it. That's right. Any other stuff? Any other stuff, like stories about the book of Daniel? You remember the hand writing on the wall? That's from Daniel as well. So that's why we have the English phrase, oh, can you see that handwriting on the wall? That's exactly from the book of Daniel, because there's a story where there's a handwriting on the wall. Yep. So those stories are all in the first half. But we don't often read verses from the second half of Daniel because in the second half, it has a lot of weird visions and prophecies. And us modern readers don't quite know what to do with those types of writings. We're not so comfortable reading them because the message isn't as obvious as like the Lion's Den or the fiery furnace. We're just not used to that kind of writing. Well, remember when we first started talking about the Old Testament, I used the illustration of a newspaper or a news website with lots of different kinds of sections. It's all news, but there could be sports writing, there could be obituaries, there could be political news, there could be, like the TV guide listings, there could be lifestyle suggestions. So all different kinds of writing styles, but still in one newspaper or website. In the Old Testament, as we've been talking, has a lot of different kinds of writing styles in it. And the one that we're going to talk about tonight that is included in the book of Daniel is one that isn't, it doesn't have as many examples in the Old Testament as the others do. And it's kind of strange, so it's often overlooked. So this writing style is apocalyptic literature. And it was kind of a genre back then. Like these days we have genres like mysteries and romance novels and humor and action movies. Well, apocalyptic literature was a genre of writing that a lot of different people wrote in that kind of style back then. And the most well-known apocalyptic writing in the Bible for us would be the book of Revelation, because most of the book of Revelation, after like the first couple of chapters, is those kind of apocalyptic literature, strange kind of vision-y stuff. But there are other examples of apocalyptic writing in the Bible as well. There are some parts of Ezekiel, and like I said, about half of the book of Daniel is this kind of apocalyptic writing style. So think about those kind of passages and Bible verses. Think about the book of Revelation. What are different elements in that kind of writing? What's involved? What's included when you think about the stuff that's in Revelation? What would you say?
Symbolism.
Symbolism, yeah. What else? Like what's going on? What things are happening?
It also talks about it's future oriented.
Yep. It looks ahead. And it looks a little ahead, and also
Looks to the end.
it looks to the end as well. Yeah. Yep. So soon and the end.
And there's also a lot of insinuations that this is what they may be talking about, but we're afraid to mention it because at that time, we could be a lot of trouble.
That's right.
They make references to things like Nero. References about Nero, but they do by spelling out his name.
That's right. There's a lot of insinuations, a lot of hints, but that's why the symbolism was used, so it's not quite on the nose. It's a little more kind of hidden, yeah. Let's see, there's a lot of weird creatures, it's fair to say. If you've ever skimmed through Revelation, there's a lot of funky creatures going on, and we're going to see that in Daniel as well. What else can you think of, like when you think of stuff that happens in Revelation? What else did I think of? Yeah, that's what I thought. Yeah, I'll just write a lot of big kind of supernatural events. That covers a lot because there's just kind of a lot of stuff that happens, a lot of stuff that goes on. Yeah. So when we look at the second half of Daniel, there's a lot of similarities between it and Revelation because it's that same kind of genre, it's that same kind of writing style. And like Ray was saying earlier, the messages that this writing style wants to convey, they try to make it not so obvious, like we said. So that's why they use a lot of symbolism, a lot of what sounds to us like amazing imagery and weird creatures and plagues and locusts, so that only later, or maybe even at the time, maybe just kind of people in the know could see and notice and realize what they were talking about. Because, like Ray was saying, apocalyptic literature was often used and written during really hard times. During times where the people, God's people, might have been living under some other foreign king or foreign empire that was oppressive or did things to them or prevented them even from, worshiping God or would destroy the temple, just whatever, the big bad, emperor or king that was in charge doing bad stuff on the people. That's when you see apocalyptic literature being used. And so, like we said, they had to be a little cagey about it so that, during Revelation, John of Patmos isn't going to say, Rome is awful. We hope they die. One day God will destroy this awful, awful empire. You can't just say that, because then when the Romans get it, they'll be like, oh, we're going to go take that guy out and destroy every copy of this Revelation. So they had to be a little cagey and use a lot of symbolism. And also in apocalyptic literature, they're trying to speak to the times that people are living in, whether it's in Daniel or during Revelation. So a lot of the stuff that, a lot of the symbolism they use, it's really bad stuff that's happening. There's a lot of destruction, whether it's plagues or deaths or like the attacks of all kinds of creatures. So it's bad stuff happening. There's judgment that happens, usually punishment that's dished out to whatever creature seems to be the strong man of the vision. So like in Revelation, like I said, they're not just going to say, one day Rome will be no more. They talk about like the beast or the whore of Babylon or something. And in Daniel, we'll read some next week, it's not just going to say, Persia or Greece or something. They're going to use other animals like the shaggy goat with 10 horns. And one of the horns also has horns, and it talks, and it says these terrible things. And you're like, what is he talking about? But he can't just say, King so-and-so is awful, because then they would have destroyed all the copies of the book. So it had to be a little vague, had to be symbolic, so that hopefully the powers that be wouldn't catch on. Let's talk about the dating and the structure of Daniel. And like I said, when we first started this series, for a lot of the Old Testament writings that cover things that happened, we need to think about two questions. When did that thing happen? And also, when was this written down about that thing that happened? Sometimes in some of the Old Testament books, those dates were really close, like the thing happened and then it was written down really soon after. Some other Old Testament stories, the thing might have happened a long time ago and then it was written down later. And it was helpful to think about, why was it written down then? What might its readers at that point have thought about this story of things that happened earlier? So let's read the first 7 verses in Daniel to give us what the context of the book is. Here's Daniel chapter 1, verses 1 through 7. Oh, that reminds me, I've got handouts. Shame on me. Can I get some people to hand out handouts, please? Thank you, Ms. Pat, and you can deputize someone else to help you as well. On one side, there is a timeline for things that happened in the book of Daniel, and it includes some of the names that are that are dropped, like some of the names that are dropped in the book, the references that are made throughout the book about kingdoms and rulers. So this is a Daniel timeline, and for anybody watching at home, I'll put a copy of this handout in the video description below. So on one side, you've got a timeline of all the things and the people that are mentioned in the book of Daniel. And on the back is a map of the Middle East during that time that kind of tracks what's the big controlling empire in order. Like one empire would control the whole region, and then after 100 years or something, another empire would get stronger and would defeat that one, so that they were in control, and then another 100 years later, they would be in control, etc., etc. So you can use the timeline and the map to kind of see, like, okay, this is when Persia was in control. Where are they? This was when Assyria was in control. Where are they? Babylon, etc., etc. So, reference that timeline and map as I read these verses, because these verses are going to name check some of the events, especially the first one or two in that timeline. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring in some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. Among these were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar; to Hananiah, Shadrach; to Mishael, Meshach; and to Azariah, Abednego. So, the book of Daniel centers around this young man. He starts as a young man at the beginning of the book, but then ages as time goes on. It centers around Daniel, who, as we read, was a young Jewish nobleman of either the royal family or the nobility class, and he is one of the first group that is exiled to Babylon. And we talked about the exile a lot over the last few weeks because it was the big awful thing in the Old Testament timeline that really influenced a lot of the Old Testament writings, because it influenced what the Israelites needed at the time and what kind of comfort they needed, what kind of questions they had. So he is taken to Babylon in like the first wave of exiles, and the story of the book takes place from around the year 600 BC, maybe specifically 594 or so. So around the year 600 BC to about the year 530 BC. That seems to be when Daniel was doing the things that the book records. The first 6 chapters are about Daniel and his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It's interesting that whenever, and I assume all of you, talk about these people, we use the Hebrew name for Daniel, what he was named originally, but we use the Babylonian names for his 3 friends. I don't know who in the Baptist church hierarchy decided we would do that, but I've always referred to Daniel as Daniel, not Belteshazzar, as he was renamed. But I've always referred to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego with their Babylonian names, not their original ones. So, interesting thing to note. The first 6 chapters are about Daniel and his friends, and they are told in the 3rd person. Daniel did this, he did this, and then later this happened. Then in the second half of the book, chapter 7 through 12, it switches, and the voice of Daniel takes over as he describes visions he has of things that would come later. And that was one thing we talked about in apocalyptic literature. It's future-oriented, what things might happen next, and then after that, and then after that. So now the question, when did the events happen from the book of Daniel? Well, it was about the year 600 BC to 530 BC. Now the question, when was it finally written down? When did they put pen to paper or quill to scroll, as it were? And that question is a little tricky to answer because the earliest copies of the book of Daniel that have been discovered, the book itself, it's not all written in the same language. So you go, was this part like earlier and then this part was written and then this part was written perhaps? like over a period of time, it was kind of added to, and then finally it was collected at a later date. So if you're interested in kind of biblical languages, Old Testament languages, about half of the book is in Hebrew, which is what most all the Old Testament was written in, Hebrew, which is what the Israelites spoke. Half of the book is in Aramaic, which would have been a later conversational kind of language. But there were some parts of Daniel that were written in Greek, which would have been the language that would have come later when Greece kind of took over and it was the controlling empire. So the early manuscripts that have been discovered of the book of Daniel, there's parts of it in Hebrew, parts of it in Aramaic, parts of it are written in Greek. And when the Protestant Reformation happened about 500 years ago, us Protestants, Baptists, Lutherans, Methodists, Episcopalians, decided that the chapters written in Greek should not be included in the rest of the book when we publish and read our Bibles. So, if you kind of have a Bible that is read at a Protestant church, your book of Daniel will have 12 chapters, but if you go to like a Catholic church, their book of Daniel is a little bigger. And there's a couple more, like 4 or so chapters more-ish. And if you have one of the big reference Bibles that includes all of that, and you're curious, you can read them. So I put mine on the table right there in front of Cosette, and I know Joe is a learned man of letters, so he has one as well. And it includes some of those extra books of the Old Testament that Protestants decided to take out because they didn't think they were the books were worthy enough, or chapters were worthy enough to stay in the Bible. And some of those chapters, there's, you see like a prayer song that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego pray and sing during their fiery furnace experience. There's 1 or 2 other stories. There's a story where Daniel is put back into the lion's den, which is interesting. And there's a story like Ray was mentioning earlier, like a woman is accused of this, and then Daniel has to come to rescue, and here's what he's up to. There's a dragon involved in one of them. So really kind of interesting. And it's kind of interesting to see what was included in the book of Daniel up till about 500 years ago, when the Protestants decided that the Greek chapters were probably the later additions, so they didn't want those included in the Bibles that we published. So, when we try and figure out when maybe was the whole book finally completed, or kind of they stopped adding to it, and it was finished and finally written down. It's probably going to be a later date, because some of the earlier events it talks about in the first half, the details are a little fuzzy. Like when it'll talk about certain kings, it'll kind of get the names wrong or the order wrong, almost like it was ancient history by the time the book was finally written down. And you'll see, like if you try and read through kind of the chapters kind of 4, 5, 6, 7, you'll kind of see it's not even kind of in order. It'll kind of go like in the first year of this king, and then in the next chapter it's a different king, and in the next chapter it goes kind of back to this king. So it doesn't kind of flow chronologically, and it'll say like King Darius, son of Xerxes, when there wasn't a King Darius, son of Xerxes kind of thing. So it seems to be that it was finally written down later, and the earlier stuff was that kind of ancient history, and they were a little fuzzy on the details. But the events it talks about that happened like in the 2nd century BC is really accurate, and it really nails those details, like the powers that were involved, the political struggles that were going on, the bad things that the kings did. And those descriptions seem to stop talking about events in around the year 160 BC. So that's kind of what the theory is. Most Bible scholars think that the book of Daniel was finished being collected as a book around the year 160 BC. Like maybe they had the stories that were passed down from generation to generation about who Daniel was and what he did, and like all the miracles that he was a part of. And they kept those stories. And then finally in 160 BC, maybe they made sure to write them down. So what was going on at the time in the year 160 BC? Well, at that time, the Jewish people and the Holy Land was controlled by Greek kings, some of whom were very ruthless, and there was a lot of persecution going on. There was even a time when worshiping God was outlawed, and you were not allowed to do it. Sound familiar to any stories in Daniel? Exactly. So we can kind of see, no wonder this story, the story of Daniel, church leaders would have thought, our people need to hear this. We need to write this down and get it out to them so they can be inspired and know that there used to be another time when our people were not allowed to worship God. So this can help inspire them even today. So it kind of makes sense that it was put together at around 160 BC when they were going through these other tough times, that the stories of Daniel could really inspire them and really help them get through. And that's what the book does. The book encourages faithfulness to God and gives its readers hope, even in the face of oppression or death. And the book promises that one day the kingdom of the world, all the kingdoms of the world, will come to an end, because they are not forever. But God's kingdom is, and God's kingdom will remain. We'll probably read through the New Testament, maybe in some time in the future, and when we get to the book of Revelation, that's really the same message. All the, when we read Revelation, we think, man, those are some funky events going on with some funky creatures and crazy stuff. And it's true. But the main message of Revelation is that all the hard times you're experiencing now, all the kingdoms of this world will come to an end, because they are not forever. Only God's kingdom is forever. And so that's the message that the book of Daniel was trying to get across to its original readers. Both with the historical stories that it was saying about the person Daniel in exile in Babylon, and also about the later persecution they were going through. So, if that's what the book of Daniel was originally meant to do for its original readers during their life and their times, how in the world could this book, or the book of Revelation maybe, say anything to us and to our times and to our lives today? Well, what do you think? How can the book of Daniel, with all its specific historical stories and crazy sounding visions, how can it speak to us today? What do you think?
Well, one thing, we live in an instant society. We want everything right now, we want everything done right now.
Mm-hmm.
At one point in Daniel's book, he was worried about all these things that he was seeing in his mind. So he prayed, and he prayed, and he prayed, 20-some days. And finally, an archangel came to him and said, listen, Daniel, I heard you the first day you prayed. But I tried to get through, and the king of one of the kingdoms fought him off. He had to go back and get Gabriel to come help him go through. Well, I mean, it sounds modern day stuff. But the point is that he was answered. He was answered. And with us, our prayers, we will be answered.
Even if it's not as immediate as we want it taken care of. Yeah. Because we are in the throes of it, and it just feels like bad stuff all around. We pray that God would take it all away right then. But the book of Daniel and Revelation can remind us. It might last for a while. It might last for the night, as it were. But there will be a morning when joy will come, because that's what's eternal. Yeah. How else? How can this very interesting, peculiar book speak to us today, or help us today? not be afraid of lions, perhaps? Yes, goes in.
The Bible gives us a very big picture
Mhm.
over thousands of years.
Mhm.
And so it helps us understand and be humble that we're just like a dot, but
Mhm.
it's such a big picture.
Mhm.
And then there's different stories, we find out, no, we have a purpose here. And this is what God wants us to do.
Yeah.
Yeah, I oversimplified, but.
I think that's a great point. And when you look at the events that the book of Daniel covers, like over a period of like 400 plus years, it helps, and then the whole Old Testament, it helps give you that kind of bigger perspective, which we need so much now more than ever. Like humans always kind of have that, like whatever's going on now is the most important thing kind of perspective. But like Ray said earlier, our society now is just so focused on the immediate, on demand, that whatever is going on right now is just the most important thing in the world. And we end up making mountains out of molehills, and we end up getting upset or getting mad or how can you do that? I can't believe this, or blah, 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 that person said this or did that. Blah, 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 blah. But if we just take a step back and kind of try to have that sort of a grand scheme perspective, that kind of larger view, it puts things in their place. And we realize, okay, I don't like that thing, or this is, it's uncomfortable to walk or something, but it's not going to be forever. And it's not in God's grand scheme of things. This is just a little blip. Yeah.
And it gives us hope.
Mm-hmm.
If we could see the Bible as a whole, Old Testament and New, and how all this came along and how it took us very many years to do so. But, I mean, I think it's lots of fruit for hope, that we can really be hopeful.
Yeah. Absolutely, I agree. And I think that is the ultimate intention of the book of Daniel, and similarly the book of Revelation, is to give hope to people who were really suffering and scared during hard, crazy times when they thought the world's gone upside down, it's crazy stuff happening here. And so this book wrote about crazy stuff happening, and in the end, only God remains, and only God's kingdom remains. And that truly does give us hope. Okay, well, let me hear what kind of further questions or items or subjects that we haven't covered in our Old Testament overview that you want to make sure we hit on next week. And I'll leave some papers on the table if you want to take it home or jot something down and leave it here, or if you think of something for Sunday or whatever. What other stuff do you want to cover or you're curious about Old Testament-wise? What do you think? Hmm?
Maybe like even take Daniel, and it's a small picture,
Mm-hmm.
but it's also a big picture.
Mm-hmm.
And what the people did then, and then what happened as that went on in time.
Mm-hmm.
So you can look forward and backward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. Other questions? Other stuff? I can't believe that we covered every single thing in the whole Old Testament that you're curious about. I mean, I might be good, but I'm not that good. Questions about any of the books we didn't cover? Okay, well, I'm going to leave some scratch paper there on the table. And if you think of something, jot it down or send me a message or leave it on Sunday so that we can really wrap up our Old Testament talk next week. And we'll read these passages in Daniel and get some specifics and talk about these specifics. All right. Well, thank you for coming tonight. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord, and I will see you next week.